Take me back to the 1960s, a path lab full of grot. Bunsen's burning, centrifuge turning, agar plates smeared with snot. Blood for grouping, bugs spread for looping, medium cooking in a pot. As we worked each day, there was hell to pay for anything we forgot. In our coats so white, we worked day and night, for we were the path lab girls. In our coats so white, we worked day and night, for we were the path lab girls. Now, I joined the Path Lab in the 1960s. I know it's hard to believe, but I did. And I'd like to just tell you a little tiny bit about me. I left school at 18 with my A-levels, and I couldn't go to university because I had a mother and sister to support, and I had to get a job somehow. So my zoology teacher, who happened to know the head of the Path Lab, suggested that I try it. So I did. And I went along there and had an interview and met up with a lot of other students. There were about 20 of us, and 3 of us got picked. So first of all, I'm just going to show you a little picture of how I looked at the time. There we go. Wasn't I gorgeous? And that was in the 1960s. And I'd just come back from a friend's wedding, and she had married a millionaire. Anyway, that was it. So I went for the judgment panel. Here they are. And they were very nice to me. And I tottered in my white stiletto heels and my little grey suit that my mother had bought off her mail order catalogue, and my long blonde hair and my eyelashes, and I had a nice interview. Now, I can't remember anything about it at all, except they said to me, "What will you do if you don't get this job?" So I said, well, and it was absolutely true, "I have no idea. This is all I want to do." And I got the job. So the first thing they had to do when we arrived on the first day of work was to kit us out in our overalls. So as you can see, I'm quite tall. Everybody knows that. And these overalls had to be about, I think it was 18 inches from the floor. And they looked absolutely gorgeous on the short girls, but they made me look like a ghost. And I really hated it. So we had 6 of these, and they were kept in a cupboard on the corridor. And while ours were being made, and they were made, we borrowed other people's. Well, I got my 6 and I put one on and I thought, oh gosh, I can't wear this. So I took them home one at a time and shortened them so they just tipped the knee, and I thought they looked rather sexy. However, I got into big trouble. They said, you know, you've got to have a certain amount of decorum. This is a hospital. You could be anybody in a white coat, so you've got to let them down again. So I had to let them all down again, and I absolutely, absolutely hated them. If you look, you'll see in the pocket of both of those ladies, there are 2 little things sticking out, and I'll show you what they are. That was a loop and a diamond. Now, the loop was used for spreading things on agar plates. So you'd be spreading all kinds of things onto agar plates with that loop, and then you had to sterilize it afterwards. The diamond was for scratching onto slides and for something else, which I will tell you about in a minute. Now, my first job was in bacteriology, although there were 4 departments: bacteriology, biochemistry, hematology, and histology. And we got taken around them all to have a look, but I got put in bacteriology first. Now, histology was very interesting, and I'll tell you about that in a minute. Biochemistry was fascinating, and hematology, well, they were all covered in blood all the time. So my first job was to test urine samples every morning in the Path Lab. Now, if you've ever given a urine sample, you probably wonder what happens to it when it leaves you. Well, there they are. So EMSU means an early morning specimen of urine. And sometimes you used to get a midstream specimen of urine, which meant you had to stop halfway, catch some, and then go on. Now, the reason for that is that the specimen could pick up bits and pieces of bugs from your exterior genitals. I hope you're not shy, any of you. Anyway, if you look at the first one, Mrs. Smith on the left there from Ward 6, she's sent in a urine sample. I'm sorry it's a bit bright, but that's how she looked on that day. Now, Mrs. Smith would have her urine sample tested for sugar to see if she has diabetes. And then you look at the next one, Mrs. Brown from Ward 4. She's a bit murky looking, so it does suggest that she might have a urinary tract infection of some kind. Well, Mrs. Price on the right from Ward 9 looks as if she's got some blood in her urine, so those are all rather suspicious. However, these came from the hospital, so these come up from the wards and from other local hospitals as well, and we used to test these every morning. However, we used to also get samples from GPs sometimes, and GPs were notorious. So you'd get something like this, and you'd get this jar with urine in and little red bits, but it was strawberry jam. So we'd have to sort of ask them to do it again. Here's how we used to test for the sugar. We had some little things called ACE tests or ACE tests, and you'd put a drop of urine on it. And if it turned sort of creamy coloured, that was okay. But if it turned purple, the one on the right, that was because there were ketones, and that was a suggestion that there's possibly diabetes going on there. The other thing I used to check for was albumin, which, as you probably realise, is something to do with kidney failures and people who are pregnant, things like that. So this is what we used to do with the albumin. It's Mr. Wincy from Ward 5, and we used to test the urine against these colours. And you see the one at the bottom, the dark one, the really dark one, he's absolutely loaded with albumin, and there were other tests you could do as well. One of the other things I had to do when I first went there was to dispose of a very valuable commodity. And this shocked me enormously because this is what I had to do. Now, when you give blood, you probably think that it keeps forever and gets used in the hospital and everyone's very grateful. Well, whole blood only keeps for about 42 days, refrigerated, but mostly it's divided up. And they divide it up into plasma, red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets. They don't want the white blood cells. They want the red blood cells, called erythrocytes, because they carry oxygen, and the platelets, thrombocytes, which stop you from bleeding to death. People who have various ailments might have deficiencies with some of these. Plasma, if frozen, will keep for a year, which is quite good. And you can also donate blood by a system called epheresis. That's EPHERESIS. And you can do that every 28 days if you just donate plasma. And that's the straw-coloured part of the blood. And if you do that, they take your whole blood out, nick the plasma, then pump what they don't want back into you. And they can do that with platelets as well. And if they take the platelets, they don't freeze them or chill them. They keep them at room temperature, being continually stirred for 5 days. You see the blood everywhere. It's awful. There was no hygiene about it. No mask, no gloves, no goggles. Just me and a sink pouring loads of this out-of-date blood. Once it's gone off, and you just can't use it. Something else I had to do, which was pretty disgusting, which gave me the title of this, was suck it and see. Now, nowadays, people have very nice pipettes, but mine, you just put your thumb over and then drop the liquid down to the level that you wanted it. Well, we sucked everything up that you can think of. Anything disgusting that came out of a human body, we sucked it. And one day I got a mouthful, and I'm pretty sure it was might have been plasma, and it was from somebody with suspected hepatitis. So I didn't catch it, but I had to wait 6 weeks to find out. It's quite scary. Now, something else that happened, which you might like. This was the great urine mystery. Now, they put a container in each of the cloakrooms to see if we could all provide some urine for them. So we had one in the ladies and one in the men's. And we gave them a lovely load of urine. And this was so they could do tests against it to look at normal urine and urine that had things wrong with it. But when they looked at the men's urine, it tested for diabetes. So they had to test all the men again, and they found out that one of the students who started when I did had diabetes, and he didn't know. One of the other things I had to do as part of my duties was to go over to the maternity department fairly regularly. Now, the reason for this was that when a lady gives birth, she provides a placenta. So I used to go all the way through the hospital with a casserole with a lid on it and a tea towel over it, and I'd go and wait in the maternity wing, and then they would bring out Well, I give them the bowl, and they'd bring out this placenta. Then I'd put the lid on it, cover it with my tea cloth, and walk all the way back through the hospital, cutting through wards and getting into trouble with sisters. And then this was not wanted in the path lab, but it used to be sent off to one of our sister hospitals where they did virus experiments. And so this is what happened to the placentas. Not all of them, I just think as they needed them. The other thing, which was much more upsetting, was one day I was sent over and told to particularly keep the tea cloth over because I had to pick up an aborted baby. Now, this really upset me. I mean, I was 18 and I could see this baby coiled up in the casserole. It pretty well filled it. I don't know what stage it was, maybe 4 or 5 months. And it was still warm, so I had the lid on and the tea towel over, and I walked back through the hospital, blinking back the tears. Then this fetus was sent to the virus hospital to be used for experiments. And I just wonder if the mother knew that. Very sad. Moving on to something more cheerful. The three witches. Now these three ladies hung out in a great big room with glass screens, and they sat in front of 3 sinks where they sat and washed up all day. And that was where you went if you wanted to find out all the gossip from the hospital. So you'd go in there and they'd say, "What's the news? What's the news?" And they'd say, "Guess what? So-and-so spent a night in the doctor's places where they lived." "What? In the doctor? Oh, how wicked! What an awful girl!" But anyway, she did, and she came in looking all tousled. She'd obviously had a jolly good night, but I didn't do that sort of thing. But these 3 ladies were full of fun. And I used to call them 3 witches because they cackled with laughter all the time. And they sold things. They ran a little business on the side. So I went in one day and one of them held up a pink and black striped top. She said, "Oh, this would look really nice on you. Or maybe on so-and-so," who was the girl who'd been sleeping with the doctors. And I was very flattered because this girl was very attractive. And I thought, gosh, if they think it'll look nice on her, it'll certainly look nice on me. So I parted with some of my very hard-earned money and bought this top. I used to get £25 a month, and my mother used to come up in the tea break and collect my monthly cheque from me downstairs. Then she'd take it to the bank and cash it. We'd made an arrangement with the bank. By the time I got home, she would have used the money to pay all the bills. I wasn't very happy about that. But the 3 witches were great fun. However, they shared a room with something else, which was an absolute terror to me. And one of the things that I used to hate doing was going in there. Yes, this was the autoclave. Only I have to say ours was twice as big as this. I drew this one off the net. But this thing was absolutely beastly. It was loud and hissed, and the front of it was a bit like the front of a steam engine, and you could open it to put in things. Now, the things we used to put in there, or at least our porter used to put in, were big galvanized buckets. And in the buckets were all the agar plates that had been used and were full of germs. So I used to have to put them in the bucket and put in some Lysol, which was a strong American disinfectant, and then they would go in there. Then they would raise the steam, and I think it was £15 per square inch. And some domestic cooking pots do that as well, but £15 per square inch. And then it would sit there hissing, and it was terrifying. And then eventually, when it was all cooked, they would let it cool down. Then they'd open the door and take out these buckets, and in them there would be some sort of melted white plastic, and everything else would be gone. And then I'd get the buckets back, and then I'd use them again. Now, we got a lot of pongs in the path lab, and this was one of my least favourite jobs. We used to have to boil up feces in sterile water. And again, health and safety, forget it. Used to hold the test tube by the rim, no mask, no gloves, not even a peg for our noses. So we used to do that. Absolutely hated it. And here's the notorious sulfuric acid pouring incident. On the subject of Bunsen burners, you're all familiar with these. The one on the left is your usual one, and you can turn it up to make a big flame, And when I was in biochemistry, we kept those flames going all day long. There were probably about 6 benches with 2 Bunsen's on each. So goodness knows how they're going to manage with the rising gas prices if they're still doing it. But the Bunsen burners were on all the time in biochemistry. However, back in bacteriology, I used the one on the right, which was a fan flame one, very, very hot. And I used to have a very happy afternoon doing this. So I had a pile of glass rods, and then I would have to hold them into the flame. Again, no gloves, no goggles. And then I would gently pull it out like toffee as it melted. And then when it looked about right, I would end up with this. And I'd lay it down on the side and wait for it to cool. And then I would take my diamond and I would scratch in the middle there and snap it in half. If they were too long at the other ends, I would scratch them as well and snap them off, again, without goggles. These were used for testing blood. Now, somebody had knocked up this little rack. I'm sure somebody did it at home. And nowadays, I'm sure they have much nicer ones if they still do it this way. But there are 4 main blood groups, A, B, and O. And the way they tested the blood was this. So if you came in with your blood, they'd put it in each of those. Then they would drop in each of those groups and see what mixed and what didn't. If it mixed nicely, you were probably compatible. If it clotted, it would probably kill you. So that's how they used to do it. Now, Group O is the most usual group, and I'm going to give you a little show of something. There, I drew this. I copied it partly from the net, but I made it simpler for us. Now, for most people, your blood group doesn't really matter unless something goes wrong. Now, I'm a really valuable person. I'm probably one of the most valuable people on here today because I am Group O negative, which makes me the universal donor. So in an emergency, probably most of you could have my blood. Some people would like to have my blood, but they're not getting it. So I'm Group O rhesus negative. Now, I don't know which groups you are, but let's have a look at the red blood cell types. The first one with the pink lollipops on it is Group A. The second one with the spikes, Group B. And the third one, AB, has got a mixture. So if you're AB, you've probably got one from your mother and one from your father, sort of A and B mixed. And then there are antibodies which fit these and antigens as well. And you can see that Group O has none. It's thought that Group O was the very first blood group and that the others came in about 20,000 years ago, probably to do with building up your immunity to different things. I believe that people like me are fairly allergic, and I would go along with that. Now, one of the other things blood was used for, it's not what you think it is. These are little glass files that used to go in a centrifuge, a bit like a spin dryer. And you'd put all these in and they'd spin, and the whole blood would go down into parts. So you'd get the plasma, which is the serum, on top, and then the blood cells and platelets and all the other bits underneath. Sometimes you wanted the top, sometimes you wanted the bottom, depending what you needed for your experiments. But that was how we did it. My other job in the mornings was agars. So there were 3 sorts we used, mostly blood agar, which came in big packs. And I have to say that each individual Petri dish had 2 green elastic bands on it. And as I took them off, I used to put them in a drawer. And there'd be thousands in this drawer. And I asked, what happens to these? Oh, they get thrown away. Well, as somebody who had ponytails, I said, can I take some home? And I have to tell you, I think I had these green things for 20 years. And they really were very good quality. And I used them and used them. I might even have 1 or 2 kicking around still. So mostly used blood agar. There was another one called Hoyle's agar, which was a more straw-coloured one. And that was used very rarely. But nutrient agar, oh gosh, I hardly ever used it, but I had to help make it. So we used to go through the centrifuge and 3 witches room to a little room at the back. And there, just before lunch, we'd be boiling up beef essence and other things to make an absolutely delicious smelling soup. And we put in agar, of course, which is made from seaweed. And then we'd make this nutrient jelly. Now, when I did my blood experiments in the mornings, and it mostly was on the blood ones, this is what I had to do. Taking my loop, I would take my sample of whatever was disgusting and vile. And so, let's say it was sputum. Well, the other men in the path lab used to love going, sputum, lovely sputum. And I, stop it, stop it, stop it. Anyway, you would put some of it on there, and you would do it across here, and then you'd spread it there, then there, then there, and there, until it was hardly there at all. And you could see that it got spread nice and thinly. Now I'm just going to show you a blood agar plate on its own, and that's got antibiotic test panel on it. I've removed the bugs for the moment so you can see it. So I've put 6 antibiotics on there. Look at number 6, which is the green one. Next morning, you will see all these blue blobs are not individual bacteria. They are in fact colonies of thousands and thousands of bacteria. And you can see they're growing absolutely everywhere, except around number 6. So possibly that was erythromycin or penicillin or something like that. And that's what the patient would get. Now we're coming to the end of this. I know you don't want me to, but we are. And then I'm going to tell you a lot more stuff at the very end. So the last thing is I have to tell you is, oh, toads. Toads. Yes, we're going to go to toads. But before we do, can I just tell you that I was there in a very bad winter, and we used to have all the lights go out, and there'd be people wandering around in the corridors in the dark, and only the operating theatres had their lights come on. Anyway, on with the toads. Down in the basement of the hospital, there was a big storeroom with a key, and I had to go down there and open it up in the dark and go through all these racks, and you could smell all the chemicals. It's very spooky down there. And I go right through to this room at the end where the toads were. We had 2 big tanks with 100 toads in each. These were Amazon toads, and they were vile. The butcher in town delivered very best quality liver on Tuesdays and Fridays. I had to go down and feed them. And as you threw the liver in, it was like a whirlpool. I mean, it was like, they just went mad for it. If you were late with it, they ate each other. So when it came to cleaning out time, you'd have bits of dead Amazon toad floating about. I'm trying to remember how long they were probably about 10 inches long with their legs out. Really evil, vile looking things. Anyway, I had to go down with this porter, and the other porters used to snigger, you know, oh, going down to the basement with Mary, are you? And as soon as we got down there, he'd light up his cigarette, which was strictly not allowed. And then we'd have to lift these jolly heavy tanks. I have no idea what the weight was, several stone, and tip them out, toads and all, into a holding tank, clean the tanks out, and then put the toads back. We had to pick them up to put them back. No rubber gloves. Pick the wretched things up, and you had to pick them up a certain way. You had to put your finger between their back legs, lift them up so that their head was towards your wrist. Then you drop them in. And then you had to do the other tank. Absolutely loathed doing toads. Now, why did we want toads? Now, in the 1960s, if you thought you might be pregnant, you'd go to the doctor and give him a sample of your urine. That urine would come to the hospital, and then it would be injected into the toads. Overnight, if you were pregnant, the toad would lay little eggs. So I'd go in the morning, and Mrs. Brown would have a load of little eggs, and Mrs. Brown would be pleased or not pleased to know she was pregnant. Everyone was called Mrs. for a pregnancy test, even if you weren't. Now, the toads were very boring. I mean, they just sat there. They sat in those jars overnight. And I have to say, the jars were bigger than these. They were, in fact, sweetie jars, but they would have looked too big on the drawings. So those were the toads, and I hated them. In the evening, I'd go down there with the chief technician, and he'd put on his rubber gloves, and I'd grab a toad and hold it, wriggling, while he injected the urine in. Now, it was looking for something called human chorionic gonadotrophin. That's what the toad reacted to. It's the hormone that pregnant ladies have, and that's why they laid eggs. And I'm terribly sorry, but I'm now at the end of my talk, but I've lots more anecdotes to tell you as we get into conversation.
In our coats so white, we worked day and night, for we were the Path Lab girls. In our coats so white, we worked day and night, for we were the Path Lab girls.